On April 13, 1953, newly appointed CIA Director Allen Dulles signed off on MKUltra, the CIA's top-secret mind control project. 3 days before that, he gave a speech on the battle for men's minds to justify it.
For Dulles, it was a missive into a newly declared battle for the minds of men, and would come just weeks after he became CIA director, as a countermeasure to Soviet, quote, brainwashing. The speech effectively launched MKUltra and gave a plausible reason for the dark and disturbing research. Dulles would sign the memo, creating the CIA's most notorious secret research project just 3 days later, and ironically only a few weeks after the death of Stalin, who had ruled Soviet Russia for 25 years with an iron fist.
Super-secret Project MKUltra, as it was called, was carried out by the CIA from 1953 to 1964, and when it finally came to light during the Church Committee congressional investigations in 1975, it proved to be one of the most bizarre episodes in CIA history.
It was often dismissed as a half-cocked effort of a paranoid Cold War spy agency.
The public wouldn't even learn about the project's existence until the mid-70s.
NBC News has new information on mind experiments done 20 years ago without the patient's knowledge, experiments funded by the CIA.
Decision was made at the highest levels of the CIA to do testing on unwitting Americans.
I hope I have a reasonable moral standard.
MK was a cryptogram for the Office of Technical Service under the CIA's clandestine Science and Technology Division. The huge experimental endeavor would weaponize science and psychology under more than 140 sub-projects.
But it was really about controlling human beings, both individually and en masse, in every way researchers could dream of.
The initiation of MKUltra would weaponize the techniques explored by big science, which for many decades had been funded and promoted by the Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Ford foundations, while the general public remains largely ignorant of the sinister experiments taking place under taxpayer funding and behind closed doors.
Soviet research on the pharmacological agents producing behavioral effects has consistently lagged about 5 years behind Western research. They have been interested in such research, however, and are now pursuing research on such chemicals as LSD-25, amphetamines, tranquilizers, hypnotics, and similar materials.
Among other things, investigators found the CIA had been testing the drug LSD on unsuspecting humans. One man given the drug committed suicide. The committee was never...
MKUltra would mostly be remembered for its drug experiments.
I'm going to give you this cup that contains lysergic acid 100 microgram. Will you drink it?
That's acid. Characterized by hallucinations, illusions, distortions of perception and thinking.
John Gittinger, recently retired chief psychologist for the CIA.
We could disable a whole city by putting a very small amount in a water supply.
Everything from prostitution studies to poisons to top secret weapons like the heart attack gun grabbed headlines with sensational accounts of the CIA's sketchy techniques.
You brought with you some of those devices which would have enabled the CIA to use this poison for killing people.
Good evening. The White House disclosed today that the CIA's drug testing program on unsuspecting Americans had been more expensive than the agency had admitted.
CIA secretly funneled money through scores of research foundations, colleges, hospitals, and clinics, including a $375,000 grant through the Geschichte Research Fund here in Washington.
The complex and compartmentalized management of such a large project, through front groups and with the participation of countless agencies and institutions to carry out secret research, should be a testament to just how sophisticated and shadowy government science had become.
There are names of doctors, there are names of officials, there are names of former and present CIA officials who were involved, names of hospitals, and depending on how you treat it, it could be sensational.
Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, the man in the center, was the CIA's chief chemist and in charge of Project MKUltra.
Gottlieb, chief of the Technical Services Staff Chemical Division who signed off on each MKUltra sub-project, was given complete immunity in exchange for his testimony before Congress.
In a recent deposition, Gottlieb conceded the CIA was interested in retrograde amnesia, or blanking out a period of time in a person's memory.
Ultra involved hundreds of different drugs and substances, hypnosis, narco-hypnosis, sleep and sensory deprivation, and other behavior modification therapies.
This information indicates the CIA was interested in learning how to erase memory.
They are former patients, part of a CIA-funded experiment, MKUltra.
I've heard that it was the most brutal program under MKUltra.
Like they had complete control over me.
Tens of thousands of people across North America and the world were involved in these experiments.
Drug testing on American citizens was more widespread than previously believed.
They included experiments secretly involving hospitals testing drugs on terminal cancer patients and enlisting prisons to experiment on criminal sexual psychopaths.
Military soldiers, civilians, inmates, hospital patients, and even children, without regard to consent.
It is doubtful that any meaningful form of consent is involved in this case.
Virtually no aspect of potential control of human beings went untested.
The work was done by the late Dr. Ewan Cameron. It involved extensive use of potentially dangerous drugs, excessive electric shock treatment, and endless tape-recorded messages to sleeping patients.
Dr. Cameron wanted to erase, rewrite, and program the mind and the person with all new thoughts and behaviors. And he used CIA and Rockefeller Foundation funding to do it.
Cameron wrote, "This was the way to make direct, controlled changes in personality." Is that what you were interested in?
And it would say over and over again the actual words that the individual had said. And Dr. Cameron's idea apparently was that if somebody listened to this long enough, that it would represent some kind of a breakdown, and a breakdown in a psychotherapeutic sense.
Some heard the same message 250,000 times.
MKUltra itself had 149 sub-projects, at least that we know about. You see, in 1972, after President Nixon fired CIA Director Richard Helms, he ordered the destruction of all MKUltra documents.
The committee was never able to determine the full scope of the program since one-time CIA Director Richard Helms acknowledged that the program's records were destroyed in 1973 to avoid embarrassment.
It's only due to a clerical error that 7 boxes of financial records were spared, which were later released via FOIA request in 1977. Because of this, the public will never fully know how far MKUltra truly went.
As this 1952 CIA memo says, the aim is controlling an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, and even against such fundamental laws of nature as self-preservation.
The CIA files that were made public were referred to in testimony by participants in the project, such as Dr. Charles Geschichter and Dr. Robert Lashbrook, as, quote, boilerplates. Cover files that Dr. Geschichter noted were not worth the paper they were printed on. So while we'll never truly know the particulars of the MKUltra sub-projects, what we can gather from these so-called boilerplate cover files is bad enough.
The CIA did have a great interest in amnesia.
Sub-Project 23 tested the effects of certain drugs on the central nervous systems of terminally ill cancer patients. Sub-Project 87 talked about purification of extremely high-potency allergens with, quote, greater potentiality. Sub-Project 115 studied the mentally disturbed in their environment to gain further insight into influencing human behavior. Sub-Project 40 investigated the feasibility of aerosols to deliver various psychochemicals of interest to the CIA on non-psychotic humans. Sub-Project 128 tested a method of rapid hypnotic induction, while Sub-Project 138 involved body antennas, personal tagging, radiant energy measurement, and remote polygraphs. But the most promising means of mind control would be largely downplayed, both in the hearings and the media.
Dr. McNulty says he finds it despicable for a democracy not to ask an institution if they want to be involved in such an activity. Perhaps, he added, the plus of a democracy is eventually we learn about everything.
Not everything.
At no time has the CIA engaged in any political activity or any intelligence activity that was not approved at the highest level.
There are 2 major methods of altering or controlling human behavior. The first is psychological, the second, pharmacological. Neither method would be very effective for single individuals on a long-term basis.
No trial, no jail time, no explanation beyond the CIA's need to create Manchurian candidates. Raymond.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you see the Red Queen?
Yes, ma'am.
Now here's what I want you to do. Key players given immunity, and the main bad guy, Ewan Cameron, vilified in the press. Pretty convenient to scapegoat him since he died a mysterious and untimely death hiking in the Adirondacks in 1967. Even the newspapers couldn't agree on whether it was a heart attack or an accident. No one knew that some of the men directly involved were the most well-respected and celebrated names published in leading scientific journals and defining the fields of psychology, psychiatry, and neurology. Men who simply went on treating patients as if nothing ever happened. And no one fully grasped that MKUltra was simply a dark hallway in a much larger labyrinth. Ewan Cameron didn't work in a vacuum.
Alan Dulles and Ewan Cameron were acquaintances who crossed paths in their OSS days as psychology increasingly affected warfare. Cameron was on the medical panel for Nuremberg and assessed Rudolf Hess after he claimed amnesia.
And that the only defect from which he is suffering is forgetfulness about what happened before he flew to England.
The Rockefeller Foundation had provided more than $150,000 to establish McGill's new psychiatry department, which Cameron would head at the newly created Allen Memorial Institute, built inside of Canadian shipping magnate Sir Hugh Allen's Ravenscrag Castle, the most historically elite building in Montreal. Cameron would draw from his distinguished colleagues at McGill, using sensory deprivation, electroshock treatment, deep sleep therapy, and tape loops to erase memories and break down personalities. In a paper published in the 1956 American Journal of Psychiatry, Cameron referred to the technique he called psychic driving as, quote, analogous to the breakdown of the individual under continuous interrogation. Seeking recognition, Cameron hoped to earn a Nobel Prize for automating psychiatry. Only 3 sources were cited in his work, the first being himself and another being Donald Hebb. With the influence of his connections, Cameron rose to prominence, becoming the president of the Canadian, American, and World Psychiatric Associations, along with numerous other influential groups. He was widely acknowledged as a leader in the entire field, until he wasn't. What a fine line there was between the work of a madman exposed in the worst of the files released on MKUltra and the respected and admired work of his closest colleagues at McGill, who even today are celebrated as the greatest Canadian minds of science. But Ewan Cameron didn't work in a vacuum.
Stimulation at point 2, sensation in thumb and index finger, quivering, tingling. Point 3.
I hear voices. It is late at night, around the carnival somewhere.
1934, Montreal, Canada, McGill University. Dr. Wilder Penfield had already mapped out much of the cerebral cortex by placing electrodes on the brains of his epileptic patients.
Point 4.
Some sort of traveling circus. I just saw lots of big wagons that they used to haul animals in.
The Rockefeller Foundation spent more than $1.25 million to create McGill's Montreal Neurological Institute and recruited Penfield to head it, after ruling out basing his controversial research in New York. The medical ethics differed slightly in Canada, and reforms of the 1930s emphasized the character and reputation of doctors over any legal burden on their conduct. To satisfy this, Dr. Penfield conducted, quote, treatments of last resort on only the most serious of epileptic patients.
During my life as a brain surgeon, it has been necessary to operate on a good many men and women, a good many hundreds, and to expose the brain under local anesthesia with the patient conscious,
while simultaneously undergoing a study of the brain to make the price of open brain surgery worth it.
If I stimulate again, a little lower down,
that pencil-like instrument in his hand is an electrode.
Each time he applies it to the patient's brain, a weak electric current stimulates that part of the brain.
Point 7. Movement of the tongue. Point 8.
Yes, I heard voices down along the river somewhere. A man's voice and a woman's voice calling.
Nearly 2 decades earlier, Wilder Penfield had become Sir Sherrington's most distinguished pupil. Penfield trained at Oxford under a Rhodes Scholarship, who were known for recruiting top American students to become elite agents of global influence in their fields. It was Sherrington who introduced Penfield to neurology, and Penfield dedicated all his books to his mentor. Real legacy stuff.
Point 11.
I think I saw the river. One I was visiting when I was a child.
This was experience from his earlier life. It has faded from his recollected memory.
He claims in this way that he avoided outright experimentation.
These are not experiments.
Though few other labels could truthfully be put on his probings.
Is it true that one does not feel pain in the brain itself?
No, it doesn't hurt to stimulate the brain.
Ready, on?
I had a dream I wasn't here. I hear people coming in. I hear music now. An old song I heard on the radio. A funny little piece.
These reenactments contained both visual and auditory elements in them. This was an incident of childhood which she could never have recalled without the aid of the stimulating electrode.
You'll see how it evokes a body movement or a sensation.
Ready? On. Buddy, did you feel anything?
Yes, I did.
What?
I felt that my hand was numb.
Electrical stimulation was carried out at 60 cycles, 2 millisecond pulses at 2 volts. Point 27.
It is winter, and the wind is blowing outside, and I'm waiting for a train.
Now, if I stimulate again, further forward. Ready? On.
Kneel. Left hand is shaking. Left wrist is twitching. Left wrist is twitching.
He's awake through all this? He's awake through it all.
Left wrist is twitching.
He can tell the surgeon things that will be helpful to the surgeon in terms of this brain mapping.
That's why he's kept awake.
That's why he's kept awake.
In that process, we have stumbled quite accidentally on the fact that there is recorded in the nerve cells of the human brain a complete record of the stream of consciousness.
And Penfield identified their association with areas of the brain for motor movements, for speech, for memory, and other complex brain functions.
I seemed to hear little voices then, the voices of people calling from building to building somewhere. I do not know where it is, but it's very familiar. They seem to be run-down buildings.
He even found parts of the brain that stimulated auditory and visual hallucinations, and where dreams were stored, or at least stirred from.
Dream is starting. There are a lot of people in the living room. One of them is my mother.
It is a useful, practical procedure to stimulate the cortex electrically.
The electrode recalled the smell of burnt toast in the woman's mind, which had seared into her memory during a key seizure.
Dr. Penfield, I smell burnt toast.
For this moment, Penfield was later dubbed the greatest living Canadian, even though he was American by birth and he only later took citizenship. The Canadian government even made a commercial about this scene to celebrate his life.
We just called him the greatest Canadian alive.
Penfield destroyed the associated part of the brain and she was, quote, cured. But not all patients were so lucky. A patient referred to as DT became speechless during the removal of a large portion of the dominant side of his brain and died of pneumonia a week later, withdrawn and unable to speak. Despite the deliberate destruction of the man's brain, Penfield somberly noted that the autopsy showed no obvious cause of the speechlessness or of his death. For Penfield, these risky experimental surgeries were worth it. He was creating what was known as the homunculus, a veritable map for the outer cortex, and a code towards understanding the inner workings of the brain. Under Penfield, McGill became a gravity, a central focal point for future research to orbit around. Not so much for the cure of brain diseases like epilepsy, though that too would move forward, but in the quiet conspiracy of brain doctors and their patrons who would become determined to identify the buttons of the brain and push them for shadowy agencies of the government. In the trenches of neurophysiological control was Donald Olding Hebb, a Canadian who started at McGill in education, left finding influence in experimental psychologist behaviorist Carl Lashley. Hebb returned to McGill in 1937 under a Rockefeller Fellowship to work with Dr. Penfield. Penfield's homunculus provided Hebb with a map to behavior inside the functions of the brain. By the time he published his seminal 1949 work, The Organization of Behavior, he'd spent more than a decade and a half studying learning. Learning in the neurological sense of actions in the brain, and learning in the sense of conditioned behavior.
The brain, a pulpy mass of cells and fibers.
Bonding, imprinting, and early experiences had a huge influence in the development of personality and could be used to predict future behavior as well.
We have to learn through our own past behavior the significance of the impressions our sense organs bring to us.
And if it were true in primates and other higher animals, it may also be true in humans.
Donald Hebb was placed at the head of McGill's psychology department. The work at McGill provided a new blueprint for conquerors of the mind to follow, and the military and national security agencies wasted no time in seizing upon its dark potential. In June 1951, a clandestine meeting on MKUltra precursor projects Bluebird and Artichoke was convened at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Montreal to coordinate what else? Mind control research. Professor Donald Hebb, who had been secretly placed at the head of behavioral research for Canada's Defence Research Board, was a key participant, along with two Americans identified in meeting notes simply as CIA. Dr. Hebb provided an approach to the military application of confessions, interrogations, and the use of psychological coercion to change one's beliefs and values that was based around sensory deprivation, the simplest path to intervention in an individual mind. Hebb proposed that, quote, cutting off all sensory stimulation, the individual could be led into a situation whereby ideas, etc. might be implanted, that a mind plucked from reality through shutting off the senses could be easily softened, remolded, or even shattered.
The psychological aspects of behavior control would include not only conditioning by repetition and training, but such things as hypnosis, deprivation, isolation, manipulation of guilt feelings, subtle or overt threats, social pressure, and so on.
Tests are being conducted in Canada.
He quickly received ample funding from the Canadian government, a CIA front group, and foundations like the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations to test out his sensory deprivation theories on graduate student volunteers at McGill.
Looks to me like he's been in an accident.
No, this is an experiment that took place at McGill University. Students volunteered to participate in this study of human behavior under extreme and prolonged monotony.
They were isolated and immobilized in a small lit cubicle, their arms placed in large cardboard tubes up to the fingertips, with light diffusing goggles placed over their eyes. The little rooms were soundproof except for constant white noise generated by a small air conditioner. These conditions continued 24 hours a day, even at mealtimes. It didn't take long for the subjects in Hebb's black box to break down. With Hebb writing of one man, the subject's very identity had begun to disintegrate. The extreme sensory deprivation of Hebb's experiment proved blatantly devastating. Few of the volunteers could take it for more than 2 or 3 days.
It was impossible for most of these students to take it for more than 24 or 48 hours.
At least 4 participants in Hebb's experiment openly referred to it as torture. The monotony from a lack of sensory stimulation amounted to much more than mere boredom. It unveiled a mind that lost complete touch with reality when it fell out of contact with it.
The psychologist D.O. Hebb and his associates who conducted these experiments found that deprived of ordinary, everyday sensory experiences, the subjects began to lose touch with reality.
Dr. Hebb discovered a clear threshold at which a man's mind, any mind, would break down within a matter of days. Many participants hallucinated within just 48 hours.
Those who stuck it out began to see things, hear things.
Some felt their heads had become disconnected from their body. Others felt they had two bodies. One claimed he saw purposeful squirrels marching with sacks over their shoulders, while another claimed he'd been attacked by pellets fired from a miniature rocket ship. Hebb and his researchers concluded a changing sensory environment seems essential for human beings, noting that without it, a major breakdown in thought processes akin to a psychotic break could be quickly achieved in just a few simple, inexpensive steps.
They had also discovered that a total lack of sensory stimuli made a person highly suggestible, with long-lasting effects. Not only were Hebb and his team able to make their subjects believe in ghosts, poltergeists, and outlandish stories after spending time in sensory deprivation isolation, but even weeks later, many of them retained their fear of the paranormal, often in spite of their previous beliefs. The implications for brainwashing, indoctrination, and re-education were staggering. Although the Canadian government and intelligence agencies had classified Hebb's work, it leaked out through stories from the volunteers, raising questions in Congress in the mid-50s. National Institutes of Health Director Robert Felix testified at a hearing that if you deprive someone of their senses for long enough, they will become totally disoriented in time, in space, and in their entire thought process. Without external stimuli, one is left in a closed circuit. Thoughts will go round and round and round in an endless loop. When the information is fed back in, and it's the only information available, what else could be the result? But that even nonsense would be a logical conclusion. When isolation is used as a weapon, Dr. Felix made clear, anyone could be broken down by this technique.
In the coming years, Hebb and Penfield were surrounded by MKUltra research at the epicenter of McGill neuroscience. The two trained numerous acolytes who would spread their influence in the field across the globe. One of them was Dr. Maitland Baldwin, a protege of Hebb and Penfield's who also studied removal of the brain at McGill. Baldwin was known for his bizarre monkey experimentation, which involved giving LSD to monkeys after surgically removing portions of their brains. He also transplanted the head of one monkey onto the body of another, that kind of stuff. He not only continued Hebb's sensory deprivation experiments, but pushed them much, much farther, although he admitted that anything beyond 2 days would likely cause irreparable psychological damage, something Baldwin discovered while at the National Institute of Mental Health, when he placed an Army volunteer in a specially designed box and witnessed the man break down into heart-rending sobs before kicking his way out after just 40 hours. Baldwin felt certain that the cruel yet simple technique of sensory deprivation could break anybody. Regardless, authors Alfred McCoy, John Marks, and others have reported that Baldwin was quite willing to do terminal-type experiments in this area if the CIA would provide him with expendable subjects. History claims it was actually the CIA who declared Baldwin's proposal as immoral and inhumane.
I hope I have a reasonable moral standard.
stopping it before he could begin, so he went ahead with monkeys instead. The results of his research remain classified to this day.
Hebb had refused to go further in the interrogation experiments, and his funding was cut a year later. Hebb wrote to the Canadian Defense Board, expressing his frustration at doing the thankless work for the CIA while his research was suppressed and not allowed to be published. While the CIA turned to Hebb's colleague at McGill, Ewan Cameron, to continue the experimentation that Hebb had begun.
Author Alfred McCoy claims that a lawsuit forced the Canadian government to admit Hebb's close ties with the CIA, including a 1963 briefing that coincided with the release of the agency's Kubark Manual, the counterintelligence interrogation and psychological torture manual based largely on Hebb's findings, in addition to granting Hebb a special CIA security clearance in 1964. Ultimately, Hebb, a respected university figure, was willing to go only so far with his debilitating research.